Hello, and thanks for joining us for today's webinar titled Data is Evolving, Shouldn't Your Backup Architecture? My name is Kevin Collins from Unitrends, and I'm here with Joe Noonan, Vice President of Product Marketing, and he'll be taking us through the presentation today. Don't forget, one lucky attendee will be walking away with a $100 Amazon gift card. We'll contact the winner via email after the webinar. But before we get started, I'd like to cover a few housekeeping items. This session will be recorded, and after the event, you'll receive an email with a link to the on-demand version of the webinar. I would also encourage you to ask questions throughout the presentation. You can do so by typing them into the Q&A box in the bottom right of the player. We'll answer your questions at the end of the session. At this point, I'll turn it over to Joe. Enjoy the presentation, and Joe, take it away.
Great, thanks, Kevin. Thanks, everybody, for joining us today. As always, great spending time with folks, and today we're going to talk a little bit about backup architectures and just ultimately how the shift in the way that data is managed and where it is and all that kind of stuff obviously has implications for backup, and we'll get into those. So a really silly marketing thing, right? We're talking about data evolving, and what does it actually mean here? So there's a few components to it that we'll kind of set up here before we get into some of the kind of best practices, guidelines, and tips and things like that. As always, Unitrends being a vendor, we have a stance on some of these things. I'm gonna always say that we want to caveat things that your requirements will always drive what's necessary for you, and I'll try to lay those out as best I can for different scenarios for you. So, in a few areas of sort of the evolution of data, everybody kind of understands the shift within the infrastructure when it comes to physical to virtual and all that kind of stuff, and obviously how when you start thinking about data specifically, a lot of times it used to just be more about the system, and now you're seeing much more granularity in terms of how people can protect applications and recover applications, not necessarily an entire system. But naturally, data is being born and kind of housed in different places these days. Think about SaaS, for instance, large entities, and I had some stats in here, but I didn't bring it into the presentation because it was just getting too long. I wanted to be respectful of people's time. But the adoption around SaaS-based platforms, especially SaaS-based productivity platforms like Google and Microsoft Office 365, are growing rapidly. And not just in small businesses, but also enterprises. Companies above 1,000 employees are actually adopting faster than companies below 1,000 employees, which is interesting, but both are adopting very, very highly. And then you look at infrastructure as a service. We're running into customers more and more looking to either migrate or just spin up and run applications in Amazon, within Google, within Azure on their own. So running those machines that they used to have on-premise in the cloud, and a lot of reasons for that, obviously, whether it might be the utility-based computing, the elasticity, the cost benefits, the management benefits. Ultimately, people are doing less and less in the data centers, depending on your strategy. With data being born out there in the cloud, both in the SaaS world and the infrastructure as a service world, that's naturally changing things. And I also don't want to forget, and I use basic terms like NAS and SAN here, but let's think about how storage is evolving too, right? Something that you don't really see here on the slide that's worth mentioning is hyper-converged storage. And what's happening with software-defined storage in the infrastructure and some of the implications around protecting that and what it can do as well, because a lot of these can basically act like multiple nodes where they sort of act like a RAIN, like a redundant array of independent nodes that provides, redundancy and fault tolerance capabilities across, multiple seemingly servers for that hyperconverged storage environment. So data is just ultimately, given the changes in storage, the way that SaaS is taking on its adoption and obviously infrastructure as a service, data is just all over the place. It's being born in different places, and that's a big part of the evolution because that does have big implications for how you protect. Now, another component is that obviously it needs to be, freely available and free to move. So whether it's for on-premise capabilities around workload balancing and high availability, as well as obviously replication capabilities, whether that's to secondary sites or to cloud, and migrating to the cloud, and even bursting to the cloud where you might actually have a period of time, maybe a month or 2 or 3, where, rather than having excess compute on-premise, you just basically have, workloads migrating out to the cloud and running out there for a period of time, and then you bring them back. In all these scenarios, this is, again, I think another component to how backup architectures change because the evolution of data is changing. It needs to be able to move freely so that ultimately it can be available wherever and whenever you need it. And of course, if it is going to move around, it needs to be able to transform. And this is really more around machines, right, not just data. But when we think about virtual machines, the virtual disks of the VMware environment, the virtual networks of that environment, the compute around CPU and memory, those are going to actually need to be translated and transformed into wherever that secondary location or third tertiary location is for everything to become available again. So a lot of cases you might see a VMware environment moving out to AWS and Azure and coming back. That translation needs to happen as a part of that process. So again, this has impacts for how we start thinking about data protection and backup. And then I don't know that this is necessarily architectural. I think in terms of how it can be set up, it certainly becomes architectural. But it has to do a lot more with capabilities, I think. You know, as we think about the evolution of data, data tells us a lot more. With really cool machine learning algorithms, with predictive analytics, we can actually start to use data for use cases that we didn't use them before. And I think that's actually a pretty cool thing that we can all take advantage of, and we'll talk about some of those use cases later. And then again, I think another pretty interesting concept here has to do with, you know, copy data management. When we think about a single copy of data, that single copy is expected to do more these days. And if you're not taking advantage of these things, this is something that you can start to think about when it comes to the productivity of your backups or your storage, if you're using snapshots or whatever that data management platform might be. You know, if you're looking at backup as just a backup and recovery solution at this point, you may be missing out on some things depending on your situation. So there are the capabilities to take that copy of data and spin it up and provision it as a test and development environment, which is great for those that are kind of taking on agile infrastructure and DevOps types of strategies within the organization. But then there's also compliance reporting that basically these on-demand isolated labs can help spin up, assess, analyze, and run things against, as well as analytics and reports that can all be done to help your business be productive without necessarily using that production infrastructure. So this comes to, again, I think when you start thinking about architecting backup, it's now also thinking about, okay, so when it comes to provisioning these other use cases, I can now think about backups being a part of that, and how do I architect that solution to make sure that my backup capabilities are able to provision and provide these extra use cases for me. All right, so that's ultimately why we're sitting here talking about changes in backup architecture, because when we look at traditional backup, it's obviously, okay, I'm gonna have some storage, I'll have a backup server, that'll connect into that on-premises environment, and it'll move the data and do some cool things usually around compression and deduplication, maybe encryption if there's a lot of heavy compliance and security requirements. And I'm pretty good at that point, right? Maybe it copies data off the tape, or maybe even, you know, sends cold data out to cold storage in the cloud. But when we think about everything we just talked about, where data is now living in SaaS-based platforms, it's living in infrastructure as a service, it's on-premises in virtual environments and physical environments, it might be living in filers on-premise as well, NAS devices, could be living in hyperconverged storage. With all these changes in evolution and being able to do more with that data or wanting to do more with that, it does have good implications for the backup architecture. So in terms of why, I think the reasons tend to be pretty obvious. They don't change too often when you see shifts in the way that data gets managed. You typically see a lot of the same reasons for why you do this, right? For instance, application performance. Right now, I'm not talking about backup performance, but changes in the way you do things around backup and the way you architect backup have an impact on how your applications in production perform, right? A poorly architected backup solution or an outdated backup solution can have a bigger impact on production storage and production servers and production networks and impact those production applications in ways that are obviously very, very bad, right? Backup is there really to be something in the background, something to help you as an insurance policy, although we're talking about how it can do a lot more than that in this webinar. But at the same time, what's paramount is that it doesn't impact your applications or doesn't have much impact on those applications depending on your situation. Efficiency is another one. Efficiency is a big part when you think about the infrastructure And this, again, kind of goes to network load, bandwidth efficiency, and storage efficiency, right? Being able to maintain your compliance requirements and retention and be able to do all these cool things with backup copies and being able to spin them up and provision them without taking up huge amounts of infrastructure or extra infrastructure. Freeing up your time. I think management time is always one of the biggest reasons why you might look to improve something. You know, what's going to help you be more productive in your environment and obviously help your organization be more productive. You have a lot of users. Things need to be up and running all the time. And honestly, spending all that time with an outdated backup solution or one that's not taking advantage of all the best technologies is one of those ways that you can find yourself spending too much time on backup. And then, of course, I think the last two are pretty obvious, big impacts to the business these days, data loss and downtime. We all know that it's very difficult to say, listen, I can accept zero data loss and I can accept, 0 seconds of downtime. Usually that's too cost prohibitive of a solution to put in place. It's important that people are thinking about those things from an organization perspective of mitigating those as best as possible. And naturally, as data evolves, as data is born in different places, as you look to do more with data, just basically saying, okay, well, I'm just going to, use some of the additional features of my existing backup solution. I'm not going to change anything about that architecture, and I'm going to kind of hope that all that basically works out really well. And that's obviously pretty difficult and usually an unsuccessful endeavor. And when we really simplify all those things, it comes down to total cost of ownership. All of these can actually be ultimately translated into a dollar value, right? Application performance, that has to do with the productivity of your users. That can impact your business and the dollars that your business brings in, either on the production side or the revenue side even, depending on what those applications are doing, if they are revenue facing. Same thing with efficiency around networks and storage. That's cost of your infrastructure. If you're not efficient, it adds cost. Your management time is a direct cost. And sometimes it doesn't always feel that way, but naturally your business is always thinking about how many people do I need to do a particular job and how many jobs can individuals do. The more productive you are, the more productive for your business. You can definitely put dollar values on that. And for data loss and downtime, just last year alone, downtime cost North American businesses $700 billion. So if you haven't been hit with any big outages or faced with any big threats like ransomware and other things that are impacting folks, that's great for you. And the rest of this area of the world is definitely being impacted in a way that's quite substantial. So what does this all mean, right? Does it mean that I just basically say, okay, well, my existing vendor supports on-premises, it supports infrastructure as a service, and I can protect those, or I can use that as a DR site. I can protect my software as a service platforms, and it has great analytics and copy data management capabilities. And in the end, you are looking for those things. That's how you get that's basically how you solve all those problems. But as always, there's a little bit more to it, right? We're here to talk about architectures in a lot of ways, not just capabilities. So wanted to give you some insights into the how to protect some of these scenarios, especially the newer ones. So we'll start with SaaS. And what's interesting is that there are kind of two simplified approaches that you can look at when you're looking to protect software as a service. First, you can extend your on-premise solution. So if I'm leveraging my existing incumbent and vendor and it has the capability to pull that data from that SaaS platform and protect it for me, that's one way of doing it. And the other way is to look at cloud-to-cloud solutions, right? So is that traditional architecture really right for protecting SaaS-based applications, data that lives and breathes in the cloud on servers that you don't manage and with other infrastructure that you don't manage? Do you need to really make your infrastructure that you do manage a part of that? So if we take a look at comparing those two options, right, we'll look at a few different features here just to give you an idea. First, let's look at cost. Now, typically, what you'll see when you actually purchase a number of vendors that are, whether they're extending the on-premise capabilities that they have or whether it's something that's purpose-built or cloud-to-cloud. And by the way, cloud-to-cloud really just means that the solution protecting your SaaS-based offering is also SaaS-based. All the data is being stored in the cloud as a part of the backup process. all recovery is self-service, and you can basically recover back into that production environment or pull it out if you need to. So that's what I mean by cloud to cloud. Usually, these are typically priced on a per-user basis. And a lot of them are subscription-based, by the way. So when you see those really low prices, like $2 or $3 per user, that's usually per month. Those can still add up, obviously, but naturally they include a lot, which is really good. But what they don't always include, obviously, if you're extending your on-premises solution, something that's important to think through here is that there are hidden costs, right? So my backup server, I don't have to worry about that with a cloud-to-cloud solution, but I do if I'm going to extend my on-premises solution. Now, maybe I already have that backup server implemented in there, so that's not that big of a deal to you, but it is something that you have to consider as additional costs related to protecting a SaaS-based environment, is having that server there on-premises to manage. Same thing with backup storage. That can be local when I extend the on-premises solution, but in the cloud-to-cloud environment, it stays in the cloud. Right? And that distinction is pretty important, right? Because that also adds more to the management and cost of that on-premises solution. Now, when we think about the WAN, this is a really important part of this discussion, I think. When I talk with a lot of folks that kind of look to just extend from their on-premises solution to pull that data back. Now, for both backup and recovery from a SaaS-based platform, you're now impacting your network. Right, and that impacts your production applications and your users accessing your infrastructure. So you're taking on some additional impact there, again, for both backup and recovery. And on the retention side of things, if you extend your on-premises solution, you're bound by your storage. If you're leveraging cloud to cloud, obviously you're using cloud storage. It's highly elastic, pretty much unlimited. And for backup copies, right, it's always important to make sure that you have multiple copies of your data. We always preach, 3-2-1 rules and things like that, and have 3 copies of your data, 2 different media, 1 off-site, all that kind of stuff. And there's variations to that rule that work for people. But in the end, you just want to make sure that you have redundancy with your backups, and making sure that you have copies is important. Now, if you're pulling everything back on premises and managing it through your own storage, you're also on the hook to manage the backup copy process, the backup copy storage, and everything else along with it. In a cloud-to-cloud scenario, when you leverage cloud storage for this, cloud storage is obviously highly redundant already. So the copy component of that is already taken into account. You do want to make sure there's separation from the production platform environment with your backups, but the high availability of those and high redundancy of those cloud storage vendors obviously does allow you to have a lot of built-in redundancy for your backups, so that can be automated for you. So the big message here is there's a lot of hidden costs to be aware of. Now, this doesn't mean that extending your on-premises solution to back up Office 365, for instance, is a bad thing. But what it does mean is that if you compare prices and you see something that says, well, it's only $2 for me to extend my current solution, but it's $3 for me to go to this cloud-to-cloud solution, well, yeah, that's an extra $1 per user per month, but at the same time, you're eliminating the need to handle backup storage and server infrastructure. The same thing with managing that infrastructure, as well as the overall compliance aspect of your backup copies and retention. And not to mention that by pulling everything over the WAN for backup and pushing everything back out, you're now impacting both your RPOs, how quickly you can back up and how frequently you can back up, and your RTOs, your recovery time objectives, for being able to actually recover quickly. And of course, that WAN impact also impacts your production applications, right? Because you're using your network, and obviously with the distributed workforce we have today, many people are accessing your data center over that internet connection. So there's a lot of hidden costs to just consider there. Some of them might be sunk costs that you've already, because you already have the solution in place, so maybe the storage and server infrastructure doesn't seem like that big of a deal. But the additional management that goes along with backup copies and the impact to your RPO and RTO and your applications because of the WAN impact, those are things you still want to obviously consider. Again, could totally work for you, but those are things I would definitely recommend trialing out and testing when you're looking at either extending versus using a cloud-to-cloud solution for protecting SaaS environments. Now, what about infrastructure as a service? So that one's pretty interesting. So I think it ultimately really depends on how you're using it, because there are a lot of use cases these days. Not everybody is necessarily running all their production stuff out there, or even some of it. You might be using it for just cloud disaster recovery. You might be using it in a process of migrating out there. So that's a use case to consider. Now, you could have infrastructure out there, or after the migration, you know you're going to have to actually protect it. So when you have those VMs running in AWS, for instance, in their EC2 cloud, or in the Azure Compute Cloud, protecting those virtual machines is still very important. And by the way, if you don't think it is, just be aware that your data is not protected by the cloud provider. They're not going to give you an SLA that says, hey, if somebody deletes a file from those VMs on their own, that I know that I'm going to get it back for you somehow. They're not. They're just going to leave it up to you. They're going to say, listen, you're screwed if you don't have something in place to protect that. You still need to protect those machines. And then, of course, I think one of the more common use cases that people started with was just offsite compliance, right? Really using the cloud as a storage outlet to send, data out there so I can have that offsite compliance for my own premises environment. So it really depends on how you're kind of using the infrastructure as a service is going to drive, I think, some of the key considerations for your architecture in that situation. So let's think about just a couple of general considerations, and then we'll talk about some guidelines there or guidance. First, cloud compute. This can be a very, very hefty charge if you're unnecessarily using cloud compute. It is needed sometimes. It depends on the capabilities and the requirements for what you are looking to do and which use case you're actually leveraging. But at the same time, there are more advanced purpose-built ways of integrating with the cloud and solutions out there that will reduce your cloud compute costs, and that can be a big, big component of the overall solution. Right? You can implement, for instance, a DR solution, and if you are using a machine or multiple machines living in the cloud to handle just the replication process out to the cloud, that can actually cost up to 75% of your overall DR solution. That includes the replication licensing as well as your cloud storage, and now because you're adding in all that compute, that's pretty expensive as well. So just bear in mind, in most cases you want to minimize this, but sometimes it is a necessary evil, and we'll talk about those necessary evils. Before we do, cloud storage, right? You typically do have options here. You can use cheaper object storage. So Azure calls this blob storage. AWS uses S3, simple storage service. So within these storage capabilities, obviously the object storage stores data in a way that allows it to be much less expensive from an infrastructure perspective for those providers. And you can honestly get down to a cent, even below a cent per gigabyte per month for this. Now there's also block storage. Now block storage is what you would expect, right? It's faster, it's usually connected to some form of compute engine like a virtual machine. For Amazon, this will live in EC2, in the Elastic Compute Cloud, and for Azure, it'll be in the Azure Compute Cloud. And these obviously, being connected to virtual machines, that means there is compute costs usually associated with using block storage. And the block storage itself is faster, more highly accessible, so it's going to cost more as well. In the end, though, still, you may find, based on your requirements, that you need the performance and availability of the block storage. And, of course, bandwidth. Depending on your situation, you may be just fine, sending data over the, the wire in, just a compressed form. But there are times where you might have a pretty weak connection, or you might be sending too much data, and you need something that's going to optimize that connection for you. That can have an impact, obviously, on your overall architecture when it comes to using infrastructure as a service, because if you really want to get solid WAN optimization, WAN acceleration, UDP netting, the things that happen when basically you can have compute on both sides, one on your site and then an instance of software in the cloud that make that connection together and provide that optimization, that's going to drive the need for using cloud compute. Right, so we talked about sometimes there's a requirement there. So yes, you'll take on that cost of using cloud compute, but with the benefit that you gain there is the ability to move data faster and more efficiently between on-premises and the cloud. So there are some trade-offs there. And same thing with storage efficiency. Typically if you're just sending data out to the cloud in sort of a cold storage fashion, and you're not leveraging any compute on the other side, you can get some efficiency out of this by leveraging local capabilities for hashing and deduplication and compression. But typically, if you want to globally dedupe all of that data in an effective way, because you can attempt to do global deduplication with no compute in the cloud, it can just be very, very painful when it runs through the process, especially over time. It's not something you notice right away, but over time, your performance can be impacted pretty severely. So if you do want solid global deduplication to really reduce your footprint, because you know you're going to keep very long-term attention, it can still actually be effective for you to have compute out there using block storage and still be cost-effective in comparison to the object storage just because of the extra efficiency you get. So how do we use that to guidance, right? And your requirements are definitely going to vary, but if cost is absolutely critical, I would say look to minimize your use of cloud compute costs, as well as always try to use object storage until you actually need to fail over. So this works out really well for backup scenarios that are using the cloud, as well as DR scenarios or even cloud migration scenarios where you're replicating data out to the object storage and you make sure you're not using any compute for that process. But then when you do need to fail over and use the cloud, or if you're ready to migrate into the cloud, then of course, obviously you're gonna take on the compute cost to deploy from the object storage into the cloud. But that's the efficient way to do that. And that's really important, I think. Now, there are some drawbacks to that. So in a DR scenario, for instance, if I happen to need to fail over into the cloud very quickly and need to spin up, if you're going the cost-effective route, like we just mentioned, where you're replicating into the object storage and then you deploy into the compute platform upon failover, that deploy process can take a little while. So if you absolutely have SLAs to fail over and be up and running in a DR scenario in less than 4 hours, and you need to keep those SLAs, and I'm taking a swag at 4 hours here because I benchmarked this and have seen various results just using the same machine several times throughout the day. It's a shared infrastructure. You're going to succumb to the cloud provider's network and what other people are doing on that network. So if you really need a strong failover SLA, you might want to consider using compute in the cloud or going with a purpose-built cloud that can handle those SLAs versus a hyperscale public cloud like AWS or Azure. And of course, if the WAN is limited and you obviously you need to get a lot of data out, you'd love to reduce costs as much as possible, but it might just be smarter for you at that point to run a machine on the other side in the cloud that can handle the WAN acceleration with your on-premise environment and get data back and forth very quickly. And naturally, if you're going to protect data because you're running VMs in the cloud and you need to protect it, then typically you're going to run something out there to manage that entire process, to deploy the agents on those machines, to handle the backup processes, to handle the deduplication and retention of all that. Typically, you'll have something running out there for those. So lots of use cases there, and obviously a lot of things to think about. I know that one takes a little bit more thought. What about on-premises? Are we done with on-premises? Is that so simple that there's just nothing to think of anymore, and one architecture is as good as another? I don't think so. It doesn't mean that all these are bad, but one thing I'll say these days is when you look at everything that is on your shoulders in IT, vendor complexity is probably one of the last things you really want to have to worry about when it comes to backup. And one idea that you're seeing here in the visual on the right is that the solution stack, as it vertically goes up, just for backup alone, can get very complex, especially as you start to include cloud, right? Because now you're adding more vendors, more kind of stages to the integration. All of this needs to be integrated together, managed together, supported together, and that can take a lot of extra time, right? That additional complexity is exacerbated by the fact that even if you just look at the on-premise backup component, when we kind of dissect this architecture, complexity lives there as well. And it's going to always be there a little bit, but to the extent that some of the traditional architectures that are out there from a backup perspective have lived for a while, even ones that call themselves modern data protection, they have this type of architecture, right, where it's very role-based. You'll have separate servers and separate instances, and by the way, all of these will be Windows-based in most cases, which obviously adds more management burden and security burden. But you'll have a centralized server or a media server. You might have proxies doing some of the work. If you have Linux machines, I know that there are vendors out there that'll say, well, you need a Linux proxy to specifically back up Linux physical machines, which seems kind of silly sometimes. Then you have repositories where you're basically running servers that are going to handle your backup storage. And if you want to replicate efficiently, there's more servers you have to run for WAN acceleration. If you are scaling out in a decent-sized environment and you want to centralize all of that into a web-based interface, that's another server. And if you want to monitor all that and report, well, then there's another server there. And if you want to recover quickly, we can have a search index basically running as yet another server. So that's just a lot to be able to manage and ultimately secure in an environment. And with threats, for instance, like ransomware, how is that impacting your current architecture today? Right? When we think about what we just saw there, forget the vendor complexity component, just within backup software itself, there's a lot of integration points and a lot of things to secure. And when they're all Windows-based, they're tougher to keep up to date. Look at WannaCry and its ability to proliferate as well and be as successful as it was. There were fixes available for WannaCry a long time ago within Microsoft patches, but it's just tough to always stay up to date with those patches. We all know that. And having a complex architecture will obviously make that a little tougher on you. Again, doesn't mean you can't do it, just means it's more work for you. Now, one of the newer approaches that we are seeing, and you're seeing this from other vendors, right? Unitrends isn't the only vendor doing this, is you get basically a hardened Linux appliance. And it's not just because it's a Linux that makes everything better. Ransomware does attack Linux as well, although by nowhere near as many attacks against Linux, just in general. But it's really about locking down the systems to do only what they were meant to do. So only expose the networking ports, the processes, and the services that are there to help it perform what it needs to do, and basically centralize that into a single unit. So you're not basically running separate instances for all those different roles within the environment. Now, you might want separate instances to scale out and handle the load within your environment because you have lots of data, or you're distributed in terms of the number of sites you have. That's all important. But having it out of the box be locked down and hardened to only do what it needs to do is obviously a very different approach than what you have to do when you have to harden those Windows solutions, especially the complex ones that require you to run 6, 7, 8 instances of Windows just to have a production backup environment. And then lastly, can your architecture do more with less? So I'm going to move pretty quickly here as we're getting low on time, but there are additional things that analytics and machine learning and automation, think about what backup is doing these days. It's ingesting lots of data, and it's seeing lots of data. Not in an insecure way, but in a secure way, it's still able to understand a lot about your data. So is it now giving you some of the intelligence that you need to be more productive in your job, to make your company more productive? And I think that's something that you want to think about when it comes to architecting solutions these days. Is it proactively telling you the impact of an outage, right? Those analytics exist today. Is it automatically doing DR testing and compliance and reporting? Is it automating those things for you so that you switch from a once-a-year painful manual process to something that might happen daily for each application? Now, this one's also pretty interesting, and it's relatively new. So when you think about ransomware, are you able to detect ransomware? So think about it. Ransomware, not only can it impact the backup infrastructure, although hardened Linux appliances help you there, but when you back up those production machines that are impacted by ransomware, we run into customers that had no idea for weeks that a machine had been hit. They just don't look at it very often. And basically our analytics are able to now tell people that I'm ingesting data in a different way than what I'm used to for this machine. So I'm going to flag an alert and let you know that there's likely a security threat that you need to look into here. Then, of course, you can use backup to recover, but it ultimately helps you lose less data and less downtime by recognizing this a lot more quickly. And then we talked a little bit about copy data management. These days, when you think about your backup architecture, do you need backup storage and enough room there to allow it to actually become a production environment and serve up production virtual machines and even physical machines so that people can use it for development and test or other types of productive use cases, right? That's a big, big help to the ROI of your backup solution when you can say, I don't just need to use it for backup. I don't need to use it just when I need to recover. I can actually make it a provisioning system for development and test, and I can provide basically production level applications to them in a way that doesn't impact any of my production environment whatsoever. And it also doesn't force me to stand up lots of extra storage to handle those copies. And then lastly, and this is a unique one I think as well, does your backup architecture have hooks that are pretty transparent to you into cloud-based analytics, right? Is that vendor looking at your system and understanding where threats might be to hardware failures, such as disk drives and things like that? Being able to understand those from an analytics-based system like Elasticstack or something else gives people the opportunity to proactively support their customers. And that's something obviously Unitrends does, but you can look for other vendors. I think Nimble, by the way, has a great solution for its storage that uses cloud-based analytics as a part of this. And it's really, really cool stuff. But not only does it just take the analytics and tell the vendor things, it can actually proactively provide support for it. So how does Unitrends help in this whole situation? So across the whole gambit of solutions, we do have a pretty broad set of offerings, right? We do a lot on premises. We can handle offsite compliance. We can handle that in the cloud. Unitrends has its own cloud offering, which is purpose-built for those types of things, but we can also leverage AWS and Azure, even Google and Rackspace for offsite compliance. And then we think about disaster recovery automation, cloud disaster recovery automation, migration into the cloud, backing up VMs running in AWS and Azure, as well as backing up Office 365 and providing detailed ransomware protection. That's how the evolution of backup has happened within Unitrends, right? And there are some architectural changes that have supported that as well, right? It's not just all about adding features to our on-premise software in some cases. So when we think about our overall solution, the way we look at things, we look at all-in-one enterprise backup and continuity. We try to reduce that complexity we talked about before with too many vendors in the stack. We try to give you basically a much more simple solution so that ultimately you have an easier time managing backup and can manage those cool production things that you need to do, as well as the extra complexity that comes with having your data living in infrastructure as a service, your data living in SaaS, and your data living on-premise in virtual and physical environments. And this just visualizes kind of how we allow that complexity to be removed when you look at taking that stack and condensing it into a box with cloud connected to it. And while this picture shows the Unitrends cloud, it does connect in, obviously, again, to the hyperscale cloud providers. Now, the reason we have Unitrends cloud is because it does fill some gaps, right? The hyperscale providers are not always going to support the scale of all your on-premise machines as you move them out there. They're not going to provide you with any recovery SLAs. And they are often sometimes difficult to move lots of data in and out. That doesn't mean we don't like them. We love them. We invest a ton in capabilities with those cloud providers, especially AWS and Microsoft with Azure. But we have our own purpose-built cloud to solve those gaps for now. And that's pretty important. And one of those gaps being we have a 1-hour recovery SLA where your entire environment will guarantee is up in an hour if you're failing over to it. From a ransomware perspective, we do have that secure capability around hardened Linux appliances. We do have automated testing that can specifically look for ransomware, but obviously just making sure you have good backups and testing the applications within those backups is critical as well. And then the detection feature leveraging predictive analytics is something new that we launched about 2 months ago and has been a pretty big hit right now considering how prolific the threat has become. And we do have analytics built into our support system, right? We don't just have good people behind it. We have ultimately technology and infrastructure that can ultimately support you proactively without you even knowing that you had an issue. And before you actually have the issue to where it impacts your backups. And that's allowed us to have a 98% customer satisfaction rating. And again, that's holistic across the entire stack of server, storage, software, security, monitoring, infrastructure, and even cloud. If you're using Unitrends cloud, we support that entire piece. And that's obviously, that support customer satisfaction rating has been something that we pride ourselves on pretty well and won recently a Stevie Award for all computer hardware in the category of support. And in our new V10, which is coming out a little bit later in June, we've added some additional analytics and automation beyond what's currently there to ultimately tell you the impact of an outage. Like not only can we test recoverability, but we can actually tell you whether you're in compliance with your RPOs and RTOs and what your actuals are on a per application basis. That tells you the impact of an outage before it happens to you. So if your boss ever says to you, hey, so if we ever get hit by ransomware, how long will we be down? How much data will we lose? You would be able to actually go into our user interface and know that information up front and kind of be a hero in that sense to be able to say, listen, I'm planning for this stuff. I know exactly what we can do. And you can uncover issues proactively as well to make sure that you plug those up before you take on a real hit. And for SaaS-based solutions, as well as failover, failback, and migration to AWS and Azure, we have capabilities here. Now, this is where I think it's important to note the architectural discussion. These are more purpose-built. You can actually buy these separately. You can buy them bundled with backup. But our Office 365 capability typically sold per user per month, and this is a cloud-to-cloud SaaS-based solution. We do take a stance that we think you should not have to manage backup when you're not managing the infrastructure and the data that's out there in the first place. So that allows you to basically protect email as well as full mailboxes, calendar items, all that kind of stuff. SharePoint Online, OneDrive, documents, all that with complete unlimited retention for all that data. And you literally don't lift a finger to protect it. If you ever need to recover something, you have a self-service user interface to go and do that. And of course, if you are looking to do complete migration or even fail over from a VMware environment into AWS or Azure and back, we have capabilities in our Boomerang functionality that are purpose-built. It's a small virtual appliance that'll ship that data out to cheap cloud storage. It won't use any cloud compute during the process. And when you push the button, it'll automate everything to bring it up in the compute cloud at that point. So huge, huge savings on cloud infrastructure costs by not using any compute. So that's kind of why we think it's pretty important to make sure that you do have purpose-built capabilities when you're looking at an evolving set of technologies and APIs like you get with cloud and SaaS. So quick summary, should things evolve? Absolutely. So investigate cloud-to-cloud solutions for SaaS-based protection. They can definitely simplify your life, especially the different use cases that you're leveraging infrastructure as a service for. And in most cases, you're going to want to minimize compute costs. Sometimes you're going to have to take that on. Like if you do need to protect your WAN bandwidth and you need WAN acceleration or optimization, you might need to use compute running in the cloud to help make that connection with what you're doing on premises, but to avoid it when you can. And of course, there are a lot of capabilities that folks don't always think of to use in their backup solutions. And listen, we're collecting and housing and ingesting lots and lots of data all the time. We should be responsible to help you do something with that, to be smarter with it. So I think, force your vendors, force your organizations to, force your organizations to start using these capabilities around analytics and automation within these platforms to make the most of them from a productivity perspective. All right, so Kevin, I think we're at the Q&A part. Our quick call to action, obviously lots of information on the website. You can try Unitrends Backup. We can download a virtual appliance into your environment, and it includes all the cool ransomware detection. It can definitely run, on your own hardware, but you can also decide to look at one of our physical appliances as well. And we'd love to show you a demo, let you see how it works, or talk to you if you have any questions.
Excellent, Joe. Thank you so much. We'll dive into questions here in 1 second. Just remember, there's still time to ask questions. You can do so by typing them into the bottom right-hand box in the player, and we'll just dive right in here. First question is, how is Unitrends Office 365 sold?
So Office 365 is sold on a subscription basis. Again, it's a subscription-based offering. It's a SaaS-based offering just like Office 365. It's sold per user per month. We have the pricing on the website, but there's 2 options. You can buy email protection only for $3 per month per user. And if you want to protect the whole suite of Exchange Online, SharePoint Online, and OneDrive, that's $4 per user and per month. And obviously, big environments have built-in discounts, as you scale with lots of users.
Okay, next question is, how much does it cost for infinite retention with Unitrends Office 365 backup?
Good. So somebody caught the infinite retention piece. So when we think about cloud-to-cloud solutions, most of those, and not just Unitrends, when you have that per user cost, you'll get all the cloud storage you want out of those. It's included. So there is no extra cost for any of the cloud storage, and most vendors are going to keep your data infinitely at this point. Now, if you extend, your Office 365 protection with whatever vendor you might have that uses the on-premise component of your solution to pull that data, then obviously it's on you to manage the retention within your local environment. But for cloud-to-cloud solutions, typically no cost for your storage or retention.
Okay. Can Unitrends Office 365 support recovery of full Mac mailboxes or just email?
So for O365, we can do full mailboxes as well as individual exchange items like email attachments, calendar items, contacts, all that good stuff.
All right. Does Unitrends support disaster recovery to Google Cloud Platform?
So you got me on that one. If you're looking at just cold disaster recovery in terms of sending data out there, and your recovery option is just to bring all the data back on premises when you have your environment back up and ready, yes, we can use Google Cloud Storage as a cloud storage target for offsite compliance and for cold DR. But if you want to spin up and actually run in the Google Cloud Platform as a part of your failover process, that we do not support today. We only support AWS and Azure.
All right, and that's the next question. Can Unitrends fail back from Azure and AWS? That always seems to be a pain.
Failback is definitely a pain in most cases. There's actually products out there that are pretty advanced that still force you to use completely native tools to do any kind of extraction from the cloud in the failback process. So with Unitrends, all that is automated. So with just a couple of clicks, you basically tell us where you want everything to come back to within your VMware environment. And in the end, we'll bring the data back and you'll have running virtual machines.
Okay. Next question. Can you talk a little bit more about how Unitrends detects ransomware?
So on the ransomware side of things, it's pretty interesting. So naturally, every backup vendor is doing backups, and that's a huge part of protecting against ransomware. When we think about that secure aspect of things, making sure you're running on something that's hardened, you just need good backups, right? And that's the point of talking about hardened backup infrastructure, so that it doesn't get impacted as well by ransomware. But also that you can know that your backups that you're going to try to recover from are good, because there's a number of things that can impact that. And that's where the automated testing and recovery analytics come from, to let you know when backups are recoverable and what the impact of an outage would be. Now, what we'll do for detection is we'll actually leverage machine learning about different machines, and we'll leverage a few different data points and metrics that we're gathering, and this is patent pending at the moment. So I actually, typically when people ask me this, I don't go into tons of detail. Plus it's also a security thing where we're not trying to basically expose how we're actually trying to stop security threats. But in leveraging what would be considered steady state change rates, growth rates, and other types of metrics within a machine, when we detect that those are out of band in a very, very large way, we obviously will flag an alert to the administrator via email or within the interface, and you'll be able to see, you know, exactly kind of when we threw that alert and when those, and exactly which machines were impacted, because it may not be all your machines, but we will identify which machines will be impacted for you.
All right. And then last question, and then we'll wrap it up. Do we have any customers that have actually recovered from a ransomware attack using our solution?
We do. I don't know if that was a layup on purpose there, Kevin, but we actually have it on our website. Several case studies can be provided around recovering from ransomware if you'd like those. A big one was actually mentioned in the Wall Street Journal, Livingston County government in Michigan. We have the Wall Street Journal article available for folks if they want to see it.
Excellent. Well, thanks, Joe. It was a great presentation. As a reminder, this webinar was recorded. You'll receive an email with a link to the on-demand version. We'll also announce the winner of the $100 Amazon gift card in that email as well. Thanks again for joining us, and we're looking forward to having you on future webinars. Take care.